Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along to my talk. I'll apologise in advance, my German language skills are very poor, so it's all going to be in English today. Apologies for that. I could try some French, that would also be quite poor, but not quite as bad as my German. My name is Helen. I'm a DevOpsologist. I did make up that word myself. I'm quite famous for making up words. It means that I study DevOps. That's what I do day in and day out. It's now starting to spread a little bit. Some of our customers have started to steal it as well, which is quite nice. So you might hear it in more places in the future. Who in the room has DevOps in their job title? Nobody. Oh, one there, two. Anybody work in a DevOps team? Quite a few people in teams. Okay. And is everybody doing DevOps? Would you all say you're doing DevOps to some extent today? Oh, less people maybe than I thought there. Anybody think they've done DevOps? No, good. Range 4, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about us. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback from the mic, so I'm just going to try and fix that as well. And I've lost my cursor. Where's it gone? So we have a motto at Range 4. We're fanatical about making life on Earth fantastic. We do that using the magic and power of DevOps. So what we do generally is we talk to lots of organisations. They tend to be enterprise organisations that have been around for a while. And we listen to the kind of troubles that they're facing and trying to challenge and trying to fix. And we use DevOps principles to try and improve their working lives. And today's presentation is about correlations between holacracy and DevOps. And if you've never heard of holacracy before, don't worry. By the end of this presentation, you might not be an expert, but you'll certainly be able to articulate what it is. But I'm not going to tell you up front. It's going to kind of come out as we go along. So you might be wondering why we called ourselves Ranger 4. And this is Ranger 4. Ranger 4 was the first US spacecraft to reach a cosmic body. It crash-landed on the dark side of the moon. We quite like this now we think about it in the context of DevOps, because DevOps is all about experimentation. We'll look at that in a bit more detail later. And it's all about failing, but failing smartly and using failure to learn. We didn't really know any of that when we called ourselves Ranger 4. We were a bunch of people that had worked together before and wanted to do something again. And this was just a name that seemed suitable for that enterprise. And you'd be surprised how often that happens. I was watching a keynote from Atlas Camp. Atlassian are one of our key vendor partners. And the founders of Atlassian did a similar sort of thing. They just came up with one of them kind of like the Greek god Atlas, you know, the one that carries the world on his shoulders. And they came up with a bit of a name that had Atlas in it. And now it's one of the world's biggest tech companies. So this guy, Max, he's one of your countrymen, a German, and he was partly responsible for putting the framework around this thing that we call bureaucracy. So let's listen to a few of the things that Max had to say. He passed in around 1920, so he's not been around for a while. So his ideas were quite historical in that respect. Principles of official jurisdictional areas. Every bureaucracy has its own special area. Firemen do not arrest criminals, doctors do not empty bedpans, and professors do not deliver mail. So this was one of his principles around bureaucracy, was that everyone had their job and they were sticking to it. Max also said that the authority to give commands is distributed in a formal way and regulated. If you imagine kind of where history had come from, this was probably very refreshing at the time, that people had some rules and some organisational parameters to follow, so everybody knew what they were doing, everybody knew their place. Max said certain people have the right to control others, and this is spelled out clearly. So everyone had clarity about what they were doing, and everyone was told what to do, and it was all very organised. And he also said the work is a duty. And I think we live in a world that's slightly changed from there now. So I think lots of us actually want to find joy and happiness in what we do and fulfillment in our work. So some of you may have come across this before. We use it a lot when we are assessing organisational maturity. It's used a lot in the Puppet State of DevOps reports. Who's familiar with them? They're a really good read if you're interested in DevOps. There's been about 4 of them now. This often appears. It comes from Westrum, and it's from about 2004. And what you can see here is 3 kind of evolutionary steps of organisational maturity. So we've got the pathological, kind of mafioso style one here, where it's all very scary. And then we've got bureaucratic, so Max's area, which is where a lot of enterprises sit today. So a lot of people, when we interview them and ask them where they think they sit, they'll put themselves somewhere between bureaucratic and generative. And with DevOps, we're trying to move across, we're trying to evolve. But we're going to be looking at holacracy today, which is going to take us a little bit further. So I did a similar presentation to this with this slide and the two that are about to follow in Kiev a couple of weeks ago, which was an interesting cultural experiment, because my question to you as the audience is, can anybody tell me what film this came from, this clip or this shot? Excellent. So in Kiev, they obviously don't watch many American films, but not the same in Germany. So yes, The Big Short. So anybody that doesn't know about The Big Short, it was a film about the financial crisis, this particular scene. Ryan Gosling's character works for Deutsche Bank. These guys all work for a hedge fund that's part of Morgan Stanley, and they've bought a bet from Ryan Gosling's character that the CDRs are going to fail, that all the mortgages are going to tumble, and they haven't yet, but the news is reporting that people aren't paying back, but the credit agencies haven't downgraded them yet, so Ryan is still making lots of money and not paying out against the bet that these guys have made. So the next one, can anyone tell me this one? Spotlight. So this is Boston Globe. The characters here, the Spotlight part of the Boston Globe was like an investigator. I've got a little bit of a cold and it's making me not enunciate my words properly. A special investigation department where they had long-term funds to investigate longer stories. And the story that these guys investigated was the endemic abuse in the Catholic Church of young children, and importantly, the layer of legal systemic failure that wrapped around that, so that this abuse was being reported, but it wasn't being acted upon. In fact, the legal industry was covering it up. Anyone know this one? Somewhere I could hear it being murmured there. So this is the Netflix documentary, Making of a Murderer. So this guy's going to prison for the second time. The first time, he was pretty much framed for rape and murder. I think everyone knew that was the case. He served his entire time protesting his innocence, the entire way through his sentence, didn't come out early, came out eventually, and then he got prosecuted for something else that, again, most people think he was innocent of. Been a very popular Netflix drama. If you've watched it like me, you're probably kind of outraged that it all happened. The reason I bring up all these three programs, not just because I watch loads of TV and film, but they all show us something. They're human systemic failures, so examples of where humans have created processes and organisations that have inbuilt corruption and ways of failing. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of the organisations that you guys work for in the room are corrupt to this extent. However, most organisations that we work with have built-in habits and processes that could definitely be healthy or bear improvement. So I got here this morning, and this is one of the first tweets I saw coming up at the event. So this is one of my UK colleagues, Matthew, and he picked up on this talk here about DevOps being about putting human beings at the centre. And I've got this talk today, and I've got another talk tomorrow, which is about how DevOps proliferates through an organisation. And both of them are very much about the people or cultural aspects of DevOps. So any of you that worked in the SDLC kind of space for a long time, and in the first session I was in, the Dynatrace session this morning, well over half the audience said they were dev. Is that a similar sort of, who's dev in this room? Oh, okay, not as many dev people as I thought. Who's ops then? And the rest of you are management, or, yeah, okay, good. Okay, so all of you are probably familiar with SDLC, so Software Development Lifecycle, familiar with the people, process, tools approach. So in DevOps, we talk about culture or organizations, interaction and automation, culture really being the cornerstone of what we're trying to create here. So John is a futurologist. He wrote a book called Megatrends, and this comment is pertinent to what we're trying to address here, that what he says is that the most exciting breakthroughs of the century will not occur because of technology, but because of an expanding concept of what it means to be human. And being a British person and seeing what's going on in America at the moment, I'm kind of wondering how that's going for us right now. But maybe that's us learning about what it means to be human, and we're going to come out the other side, maybe. So I did promise you that I was going to talk about the correlations between something called holacracy and what you're here at the conference to talk about, which is DevOps. So let's get on with that now. I've set the scene a little bit. So first of all, self-organising teams. DevOps, we often talk about DevOps struggles in some respects in the market because it has resisted a couple of things. It's resisted having a definition, and it's resisted having any kind of manifesto or codification. So when we try and describe what DevOps is, sometimes that's challenging. So one of the things we often talk about is the convergence of three evolutionary movements, if you like. And those three movements that we talk about are Agile, ITSM, and Lean. And the Agile part is really important when we talk about self-organising teams. So it's about giving autonomy back to the people that are doing the work to decide how to distribute that work. So if you remember about Max saying that people have authority to tell people what to do and what to work on, this is what we're trying to get away from with Agile. We're trying to give those people that are doing the work, that understand the work, the power to make the choices of how and when to distribute that work and who's going to do it. So Spotify, has everyone here watched the Spotify engineering videos on YouTube? One. We really highly recommend, quite a few of you actually, we really highly recommend them as a good view of trying to understand like how this works. And Spotify have grown these self-organising teams on and on and on, and they have squads and tribes and chapters and all sorts of different ways. Is anyone in the room using Safe? Nobody's using Safe. One a bit. Okay. Is everyone doing Agile? Okay, how many people think they're doing Agile over 50% well? Okay, because Agile's 15 odd years old, and most people have been doing it for 5, 10 years, and there's a great variation what we see in the organisations that we work with in terms of how it's being used. A lot of people start Agile with really great intentions, maybe go through loads of training, but Scrum is always, the adage of Scrum is it's easy to learn but difficult to master. And that's what we see a lot, people starting on an Agile journey and then kind of not following it through. So I mentioned this earlier when I described myself as a DevOpsologist. That's as near as I've managed to get range for to eschew job titles completely. We don't like job titles in DevOps, and Holacracy doesn't like job titles too. And that doesn't mean that we don't like to know what people are doing. It's just we prefer to focus on roles. And this is actually really closely linked to what we were just talking about in terms of self-organising teams. So when we talk about self-organisation, we're often also in the same breath talking about cross-skilled teams. So it's important that the people feel that if they need to move around and do a slightly different job, that they don't go, well, that's not my job, this is my job here, I just do that. So it gives you a lot more flexibility to be able to move around and have this autonomy to self-organise. There's another thing that it takes away, not having job titles. Job titles creates that hierarchy, and it creates the desire to kind of move up the hierarchy, and it can create a lot of political barriers and silos that don't help us when we're trying to do things like communicate and collaborate better. So actually not having job titles kind of breaks down a lot of those things. It's quite a scary thought for most organisations though. So this is Ticketmaster. This is a UK company. They sell tickets. It's kind of, you probably gathered that. Steve Williams, VP of Engineering. We've popped him up here. One of the things he said to me when I was chatting to him one day is that he wouldn't actually hire anybody with DevOps in their job title. And that was partly, not because of the no job title thing, but partly because of if you give someone DevOps in a job title, you're not then saying that DevOps is for everyone. And again, I'll go into this in a bit more detail when we talk about how DevOps proliferates tomorrow. But that's Stephen. So the first time I delivered a presentation with this sort of title was at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in London at the end of June this year. And I had one of our customers, Lego, over from Denmark to do it with me. And this is actually a Lego slide. And this is Lego's approach and explanation, what they'd done to get away from job titles. And they'd actually done it subconsciously. No one had actually said, let's get rid of these job titles. But what they did is that they gradually moved everyone into continuous delivery engineer job title roles, if you like. So they still had people that had different skill sets, but they spread the skill sets out a bit more and allowed themselves to move them around. So another correlation between Holacracy and DevOps is about flattening the hierarchies and distributing authority. So we're going to look at the hierarchies in a minute, but in a typical organisation, you have the CEO at the top, and then you have your layers of management, and then you have the people here, which are the people that are doing things, the people that are talking to the customers. And what we're trying to do in DevOps and Holacracy is flatten that down. So this is quite scary for a lot of organisations that have built that structure over those years, because they kind of ask what's going to happen to all those management layers. And often when we work in that kind of organisation, it's seen as aspirational to move up the ladder or move up the organisational hierarchy. It's seen better to be a manager than being somebody that's doing something with a customer or delivering something to a customer. Another word for this that I learned last summer, I think it was, from Patrick Dwyer, is about horizontal authority. So it's about, and we're going to come on to this in a moment, about asking your peers for advice and approvals rather than always seeking authority from above. So one of my favourite stories, which is a non-IT story, but I think it really beautifully explains how this can benefit an organisation, is this company here, which is Waterstones, which is a UK book chain. It's our biggest book chain in the UK. And it was part of a very small conglomerate, if two companies can be a conglomerate, with a company called HMV, which is Master's Voice, which is a music and CD company. And they were really struggling, really financially struggling a few years back, and the decision came to split them apart and sell them off. And a Russian billionaire came to Waterstones' rescue, which was a bit of a surprise, because in the UK they tend to buy football clubs, so it's a bit weird to see him buying a book club or a bookstore. But that was what he was into, so that was good. So he came along, and then we had another surprise with the stock market, because he hired a guy called James Daunt. And James Daunt had been a Cambridge grad, so one of our big universities in the UK. He'd gone into the city as a trader, and his wife had said, actually, I don't really want you to be a stockbroker. I don't really like that lifestyle. So he decided to open a bookstore in London instead, and he'd done it very differently. So in his bookstore, you would walk in and it would be arranged by country. So you'd walk to Australia and there would be novels about Australia and cookbooks and travel books and all sorts of books about Australia. So he'd done it like a geographic thing. And it did very well, so well that he had 6 or 7 of these bookshops. So all in London. So, you know, quite a nice little business. Nothing on the scale of Waterstones, and I had hundreds of stores across the country. So this was a big surprise. So everyone kind of wondered how this was going to go, whether it was going to go well or not. And the first thing that James did was he stopped telling all the stores what they had to stock and what they had to put in their window displays. And he let every store decide what they were going to put in their window displays and what they were going to sell and what they were going to encourage their customers to buy. So he distributed authority back down to the stores. So instead of dictating from the centre, from head office, what was going to be on the window displays and what they were going to sell, he let them make those decisions. So this is James, and he says that his staff are now in control of their own shops, and he's hoping they're enjoying their work more as well. So getting back to this, making life on Earth fantastic, and perhaps not having Max Weber's view, which was probably very valid at the time and has been working very well for a long time, but the work is a duty, but actually that we should enjoy our time at work. It is quite a large proportion of our lives, after all. And they're creating something different in each store, so you're seeing different sales models in each store that are working. And we'll come back to this and the importance of those people acting in that way in another correlation in a moment. But I just wanted to talk about the next correlation for a bit. So this is about peer-based reviews. So does anybody do peer-based reviews of any sort in their organisation? Few of you? Excellent. So some of those examples already. Do you do them for change? A bit. Anybody do them for change? So when Lego did this presentation with me, this is the big one that they talked about, was change. So one of the pieces of work we do a lot with organisations is go and assess their maturity in terms of where they are on their DevOps journey. And one of the really astonishing things we found at Lego when we went there was that they don't have any change approval boards. They're one of the few companies we've ever met that don't have any cabs. We have lots of customers that have multiple levels, up to 7 or 8 levels sometimes of cabs just to get a change through. But Lego have none. They do everything by peer review. They've managed to build trust and they've managed to prove things. They've managed to standardise change to such a result that they can do that now. And this is, you know, a global company, and these are some very large websites that they're running. So everyone read the Phoenix Project in the room. Can't get to a DevOps conference without asking that. Anyone hasn't read the Phoenix Project? A few of you, okay. So most of you will be familiar with the three ways. The first way is about flow, the second way is about feedback loops, and the third way is about experimentation learning. So again, you'll remember at the start when I was talking about the spacecraft Ranger 4 that crash landed on the dark side of the moon and how important that was from a DevOps perspective that we experiment. That is the third way. But the second way is about amplifying feedback loops. And in Holacracy terms, we call that something slightly different. We talk about processing tensions. So those people that work at Waterstone stores, the people that are delivering change to the customers, they're the people that need to be able to understand what the customers want and process those tensions that are coming back from the customers. Good tensions, bad tensions, things that they really want, things that they really hate. So just to recap, the three ways: flow, amplified feedback loops, and the experimentation and learning. How many of you in the room still put your budgets together on a 12-month basis? Less of you than I imagined. Are the rest of you doing it as rolling funding or quarterly, or did you just not put your hands up? That was a bit difficult to say. Look, put half a hand up if you did that. Yeah. So those of you that are doing continuous, those of you that are doing 12-month budget cycles, are you also people that put your hands up for agile? Yeah, there's a bit of some confusion there, the audience. So, yeah, which was probably created by me. So the issue is that most people that we work with still have finance departments that want them to work on 12-monthly or annual budget cycles. And annual budget cycles often look more like 15-month cycles because you have to start planning them and then they kind of get in. So by the time you get to spending the money that you're spending, you've thought about it well over a year earlier. Now, in Agile, as you all know, we're trying to do things in 2-week sprints normally, and we're trying to do things incrementally and get those feedback loops running and get people pushing change through and reviewing the change that's coming through. So it kind of makes no sense to be trying to imagine what you can be doing 15 months later when you're trying to do things every 2 weeks. So at the DevOps Enterprise Summit this year in London, John Smart was there. John Smart's a guy at Barclays, one of our big banks in the UK, and he had said that he had managed to get from 4% to 90% of his strategic change projects were now agile. And I thought, this sounds like a massive win. So I tweeted to him and I said, are you also continuously funding them? And this was his response. We're starting to pilot agile investment with a quarterly rolling wave. This is a very popular term when we talk about continuous funding, this rolling wave instead of agile budgeting. So there is this growing realization in the market that we're trying to, with DevOps, effectively what we're really trying to do is concertina or squash the time it takes from the business to understand what the customer wants, to deliver it to the customer, and look at that value stream and concertina that as much as we can. But if we've got a finance department that still wants us to do annual budget cycles and won't release money in a way that allows us to experiment and put bets on certain experiments, it's going to make it very difficult for us to operate like that in IT or in our DevOps world. This is an article by Mustafa of IBM that's actually really good at giving you some ideas on how to work that as well. I've just given the slides to one of the conference organisers, so I imagine they're going up on the website somewhere soon, and the link for this is in the notes. And this is Jan Molsky. So Jan Molsky works for ThoughtWorks, but it's also the author of The Lean Enterprise. And I mentioned Lean earlier as one of these three things that come together to create DevOps, if you like. So Lean, ITSM, so IT Service Management, and Agile. So Joanne is a Lean expert, and she is big on continuous funding. These are her views on why there are, or these are the kind of big mistakes made in the current budgeting process. So, as we just said, basing your business decisions on a centralised and annual cycle, it doesn't give you any movement or freedom to revisit what's changing and how the market is moving and how your customer demand is changing. She also says that using the capability to hit budget targets is a key indicator of performance. And there are lots of people that like to make the differentiation between a KPI and a key indicator of performance, which is probably a whole other conversation we can have. That's a bad thing to do in Joanne's world because things are changing. So if you get to the end of the year and you say, oh, great, we've done well, we spent what we said we did, that's not really a great way to analyse whether you've done a good job or not. Basing business decisions on the financial reporting structure on capital versus operating expense. So CapEx versus OpEx is always a very interesting discussion. And the finance directors like it, but I think really what we want to know is what value you've delivered to your customer and what value they've received. And we'll come back to that when we talk about automation, bizarrely, you might think, later. So her key recommendations, if we described, use these rolling forecasts, and she used the word forecast, not even budgets there. So we see lots of organisations trying to do different things here. So you can apply kind of quarterly budgets that you can draw down. You can draw down on each sprint and do a forecast each sprint on what you think you're going to spend, what you think you're going to need. She says track products or services, not projects, which is a very agile way of working. So agile is all about becoming product-centric rather than project-centric. Oh, and the dynamic resource allocation, so I skipped over that. And then, kind of generic advice, but be flexible and apply control at the right level. But I think the apply control one is quite important when we're thinking about where Max was and where the world was then and where the world is going now. So about having, we talk often in Agile about having just enough. And in Holacracy, we're talking about having just enough controls. In ITSM, we're often talking about having just enough process and just enough governance, so not having it crippling. So when people describe organisations derisively as being bureaucratic, they normally say there's lots of red tape, it takes ages to get things done, there's so many blockages and so many constraints, so there's too much governance. So what we're trying to do here is bring that down, make it leaner. So another correlation between DevOps and Holacracy is around incremental iterative improvement. So this is what it underpins both of them. So again, this is Agile. This is what we're trying to do with Agile. Lots of people struggle with this. So when I kind of had to do that question about how Agile people are, and then we talk about what blockages people are having accepting Agile, a big one that comes up is the customer can't receive things incrementally, so the customer often needs to be trained, particularly in the business environment. In the consumer environment, we've all got our smartphones. We're all used to picking up Facebook and it being slightly different this week than it was last week. But in business to business, a lot of people can be resistant about receiving changes on that fast basis. And we even have customers, there's a company in the UK called Dunnhumby, who they invented the loyalty card in the UK. I don't know whether it was a worldwide thing, but for Tesco, you're probably familiar with Tesco. I know they've crept out into Europe to some spaces. And the problem Dunnhumby had is they actually had a team of people whose job it was to educate the customer on the newest release. So they kind of didn't almost want the customer to self-learn through having incremental change because they had a whole team of people whose job it was to do that. We also have a lot of problems with product owners. So when people start moving into the Agile space and they start filling the product owner role, and they often take the product owners from the business, which makes a lot of sense because they're close to the customer and they understand what the requirements look like and they can build the user stories and that kind of thing. However, they often don't understand what we're trying to do with Agile. So we can do things to tackle that. Those of you that are familiar with the Phoenix project, we actually have a game, and the big use case we have for that is getting these type of people and IT people into a room so that they can understand together why we're trying to do things incrementally and how to collaborate effectively in doing that. So who's doing Scrum when they're doing Agile? Most of you, and I think it probably is the de facto standard now. I don't think anyone's really doing XP or anything else these days. This one might look a bit odd to you because you're thinking there's a process backlog, not a product backlog in there. That looks a bit weird. One of the things that we've been working on, I've mentioned ITSM at least twice already. ITSM is IT service management. It's kind of like, I like to describe it as next generation ITIL. So is anybody here involved with ITIL? Does anybody like ITIL? Not very popular ITIL, and it's not really its fault because it hasn't kind of been received and understood in the way that it was intended. One of my colleagues, Daniel, was partly responsible for writing ITIL, and it's kind of one of his things that he carries on his shoulders. ITIL, a lot of people have interpreted as being quite prescriptive, and the idea was that it was going to be quite flexible and you could take the bits that you wanted and model them to how you needed it and do just enough and that kind of stuff. But a lot of people get the book and then apply the book to everything that they do. And ITSM is kind of trying to make it a bit more flexible. But where we're going next with this is something called ASM, so Agile Service Management. So in a DevOps world, some people talk about no-ops, which we don't think is a good idea at all. I think you probably still need some people to understand what your infrastructure and security and things like that look like and your performance requirements. And need somebody to look after that, even if it's in the cloud. Some people just put ops people in the agile teams, but again, that doesn't always work out from a resourcing point of view. But if you can get your ops people to think in the same way and act at the same velocity that your dev people do, that gives us a whole different discussion to be had. So agile service management is about getting your ops people not to spend hours writing waterfall, effectively projects of ITIL type standards, but actually treating ITIL or ITSM processes in an agile manner. So learning the Scrum skills and learning how to interact with the development teams to deliver at a very high cadence. Transparency, another very popular thing in DevOps and also in Holacracy. So in DevOps, what we mean by transparency is this is really about collaboration. So when we do DevOps training, one of the exercises we do is we talk about what makes a good collaborator and what makes a bad collaborator. And bad collaborators are people that don't like to share, so those people that like to hold on to knowledge. We need to be able to understand as a team everything that's been going on and be able to see it. So we need collaborative tools to underpin the work that we're doing. So things like Confluence and Jira. Who in the room's an Atlassian user? So quite a few. So you'll probably Confluence and Jira and maybe some Bamboo and Bitbucket and other things. So it's very important for us not to hide things from each other when we're trying to cooperate and trying to collaborate. And I wanted to show you this, which is kind of the first very Holacracy thing. And this is a piece of technology that underpins Holacracy. And this is called GlassFrog. And it's called GlassFrog because it's see-through and therefore it's transparent, so you can see its organs. And often when we talk about Holacracy, we talk about it not being a hierarchy. And we've got a little hierarchical picture coming up in a minute, which I'm sure you can all imagine the org chart in your mind and know what it looks like. But when we represent an organisation using Holacracy, we represent it more like this. So we have a concept of it being more like an organism. So more like a body with organs and cellular kind of a cellular construct within it. So if you imagine all of these being cells, and maybe this being the heart, and this being the liver, and this being the brain, and these all together make our organism that is our organisation. And this is GlassFrog, and those are roles. So you see the green ones are filled roles, and the blue ones are called roles, and we've got no incomplete roles, I think. So this is GlassFrog, and you can see at the top you can do things like put in your projects and your tensions. So this is where you would run your holacratic organisation from. So Arrange for we've been doing DevOps, as in helping people with DevOps, for quite a few years now. And we, like many of organisations we work with, probably started thinking it was a bit of a tools thing, and then started hearing or feeling the tensions from our customers, being told that what they really needed help with was the cultural change aspect. So understanding what their culture currently looked like, what they wanted it to look like, and the kind of things that they could do to change the way that quite a few humans thought and interacted and behaved on a daily basis, which is quite challenging. That said, and who's familiar with the acronym CALMS or CAMS? Few nods. So it's kind of like an elevator. I said earlier that DevOps is sometimes challenged by not having a definition or a manifesto or codification and things, but CALMS is quite a good elevator acronym for explaining quite quickly the core components of what we're trying to deal with when we're doing DevOps. So the C is for culture, the A is for automation, the L is for lean, the M is for measurement or metrics, and the S is for sharing. So the A part is kind of key in CALMS. And if you're going to exploit any processes to their ultimate end, or get rid of any constraints and smooth any bottlenecks and make things as seamless or integrated as possible, you're going to need automation. What we observe quite a lot, though, is that organisations that kind of go, right, we're going to do DevOps, and they build a little bit of a CD tool chain, and they go, right, we've got some Jenkins, some Puppet over here. Anyone want it? There's like deafening silence from the rest of the organisation. And that's the cultural change that needs to happen to help that proliferate and help people to adopt it. And the people in Holacracy, so Brian Robertson, who set up Holacracy 1, which is kind of like the root of where Holacracy came from, Brian does have a software background, so he understands Agile. So this is, I think, partly where some of the correlations come from. And this is GitHub, you might recognise if you can see it. It's probably a bit far away for most of you. And in GitHub, this is the Holacracy constitution. So this is like a central statement that you can use for your organisation if you wanted to adopt Holacracy. So this is kind of a statement, right? This is how we're going to work. This is how we're going to treat each other. Statement. And you can branch off it in GitHub. And this is a photograph from one of the presentations this morning, Martin from Dynatrace's presentation that I gather not many of you were in because it was mostly developers. He did a tool chain which looked like version control, CI/CD, which he's right. A lot of people do think that is the DevOps tool chain. Excuse me a moment. But what he's done he's called it the DevOps pipeline of the future. And what he's put in here is the ability to troubleshoot and optimize this tool chain as well. And I looked at it, and I have a bit of a problem with calling it a pipeline or a tool chain, actually, because for me, they're both quite linear. And the last time I put up a big SDLC, someone went, well, it's not very DevOps, is it? This is about a year and a half ago. So we've kind of revisited this. So we have our DevOps loop. And this is how we sit. And we call it the DevOps loop because it sounds kind of cool, but it's really just a continuous release cycle. So we've split the SDLC down into 5 component parts. So ideation is the piece where we are gathering requirements, prioritizing them, doing our refinement of our product backlog or process backlogs if we're doing ASM, and then moving into integration. And we've stopped calling integration development. Simply because most organizations we work with aren't really coding anymore. They're composing applications much more from artifacts, in particular open source artifacts, which is why we're working with companies like Sonatype in particular to build security in very early into the DevOps loop or the tool chain, whatever you want to call it, to ensure that those vulnerabilities aren't getting through and out. One of the key tenets of DevOps being never pass a known defect downstream. And that can open up a whole discussion about value-based engineering if you have time at some point. And then from integration, we move into validation, and arguably those two balls could sit a bit closer together. And then we move into the operational part, where we're deploying, and then into the value realization. So when I said earlier we were going to talk a bit more about business value, this is it here. So this is where the organizations we're working with, we're delivering the capability that they can know that they had the idea for that feature up there, how much that feature cost them to get through their whole release cycle and how much it's actually delivering them in terms of real business value. However they measure that, and it could be as simple as the revenue that's coming through their website. It could be more complicated if they're an insurer in terms of the amount of policies that are being, or policy requests that are being completed and converted. So in conclusion, we are humans, and we work in companies and organisations based of humans that we have created as a process of our thinking over many, many, many years. I mean, we often talk about companies being sort of tens of years old, sometimes even hundreds of years old, but if you think of the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of human evolution that's come before that, there's a lot of thinking and habits and processes that have been built into these things. We do have the choice to change them, but it is quite hard. This is the Holacracy hierarchy diagram that I was talking about earlier, and I usually leave it up for a little while because it actually gets quite funny. The longer you look at it, the more funny bits you find in there. But the key thing I always see in this is like you've got the smiley face at the top, but the lower you get down this traditional hierarchy, the sadder the little faces become. Which is unfortunately how the world often works, which seems ridiculous when actually it's these people often that have most of the interaction with the customers or see what the customers want. So that's the Dalai Lama. I stuck him up there because on the left there's a book cover, and the book is called Reinventing Organisations by a gentleman called Frederick Laloux. Has anybody heard of it or read it in the room? No, so this is where I got my introduction to Holacracy, and Frederick was out with the Dalai Lama in the last month, talking to him about these organisational principles and what they could mean for mankind. So you remember the Westrum table that I showed you earlier on with the 3 columns, taking us from pathological through bureaucratic into generative type character, organisational evolution. Here we've got Frederick Laloux's from Reinventing Organisation. So really orange is where generative is at. And then green is where he uses examples like Ben and Jerry's, and then teal is where he thinks organisation should be involving too. So we've got things like self-organising and self-managed teams that we've touched on earlier on with coaches when needed. So what's the Scrum Master's role? It's a coaching role. Coaches don't have P&L responsibility or managerial authority because we're taking those sort of things away, because we're going for peer-based reviews, because we're making people happier. I don't think I've got a slide in this presentation, but I often talk about a TED Talk by Dan Pink, where he talks about how to motivate people at work, particularly in knowledge-based industries. And his conclusion is that to really keep our sort of people happy, we have to give them an environment where they feel that autonomy and mastery and purpose are nurtured. I'm not going to dwell on these too much because they're in the presentation pack and they're kind of boring, but we're trying to move from hierarchical pyramids to self-organising teams. We're trying to get to coaches. We're trying to avoid loads of meetings. We're trying to make meetings really worthwhile and get executive team meetings. We're trying to simplify project management. We're trying to get rid of lots of centralised processes. Here there are things like getting rid of the job titles, and things like compensation performance management, so focusing on team performance rather than individual performance, and getting peer-based processes for individual appraisals. And there's a lot of peer-based stuff here. So when we talked about peer-based reviews earlier, some of you may have been talking about peer-based code reviews. We talked about potentially doing peer-based change approval boards. With teal practices, we're trying to take that further and do things like peer-based recruitment, so actually having the teams recruit their new team members rather than having a manager do it, having teams running or deciding what the compensation packages and things like that look like, and what dismissal looks like as well if it needs to happen. So there's lots there, and this I bring all this up because there are frameworks here, and I think the thing about holacracy is there are organisations in the UK, like Ticketmaster, that are very interested in it. In Denmark, there is a reasonable uptick because actually the organisations are quite flat in Denmark anyway, or that's what I'm told. In the UK, I think with some of our larger enterprises, they'll really struggle to make this kind of change on this level because it's so systemic that we have people that they go to school and certain types of school and they aspire to certain types of careers and they want certain types of role and power, and they will just psychologically as individuals find it impossible to give up that kind of power. But that doesn't mean it won't look like this in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. So this was a quote from one of the workshops that I went on from one of the other students, and I like it because what we're doing with DevOps is basically an evolution. I don't think it's that revolutionary. We do a lot of assessments with a lot of people, a lot of workshops, and quite often there's kind of a sigh of relief when people go, okay, we knew we had some things to do, but we are doing some things, and we can see clearly now the other steps that we need to take. So there's kind of evolution on these different levels, cultural, process-based, and from the automation perspective. But holacracy gives you the underpinning, where Agile gives you the underpinning to understand how your development team can change their practices and their approaches and the way they do things, where Agile Service Management gives your ops team the ability to understand and see how to do things in a different way. This can underpin your whole organisation for understanding how to operate on a daily basis. So I have about 15 minutes left, I think, until the next break time, if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask me or share comments that they would like to share. Anyone? Thanks, John. I'll be here for a few minutes if you do want to ask a question. But just didn't. Oh, there's one right at the back. They're thriving. I bought some stuff there the other day. So yeah, they're doing really, really well. It's been a really good strategy for them. So James Daunt is now the golden child of the stock market. Who thinks that holacracy might work in their organisation? Okay. Out of those organisations, how many are over 1,000 people? That's pretty good too. Has anybody heard of holacracy before? I think I asked that at the start. One of you had. A few of you. Had you read Frederick Laloux's book? No, you just come across it another way. Have you started to try and apply holacracy? Great. Well, if you've got a few minutes, I'd love to chat to you a bit more about how far you've got with it today. I don't know how different it is, but I think it's run quite autonomously. Yeah. No, I think they're probably owned by the same group company, but probably, and they'll probably share things like sell across the pond and stuff.
The other thing I think is interesting is there's so many commonalities, right? You got Ron Western's policy, right, which is awesome, right? And then
Yeah.
you have Lean, and you have Toyota, right, which has a whole bunch of, and then you have Holacracy. It's like there's almost like a super pattern there.
Yeah. Trying to bring it all together. Yeah. Do we need to invent a new word that brings them all together? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for your time. Those of you that are tackling holacracy, I'd love to spend a few minutes with you if you've got some time now. See you all around. Thank you.